Hello and welcome to Lecture 4 on the Baroque era. Today we're going to pick up where I left off, talk a little bit about Monteverdi because I kind of crammed in some information toward the end there that I would have rather spent some more time on, specifically about his recitative Tu sei morta. And then we're going to move ahead and talk about Henry Purcell and his opera, Dido and Aeneas. And then I'm going to start talking about instrumental music, and I'll come back to our other vocal genres. Right? So remember, there's opera, there's oratorio, and there's cantata. I'm going to come back and talk about oratorios and cantatas towards the end of this unit, and I'm going to talk about them in connection with George Frederick Handel, the greatest composer of oratorios, and J.S. Bach, the greatest composer, at least of Lutheran church cantatas, and probably most would say the greatest composer of cantatas, period. There are several different types of cantatas, but the type that we will focus on is the Lutheran church cantata. The way that the book presents the material in this unit is a little bit chaotic. So they introduce different genres of music, and then they will talk about a composer who might have composed pieces in that genre, and then they'll jump back to talking about a genre and back to a composer. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to do that a little bit, but I'm going to skip around because I want to try and stay chronological, and I also want to, after introducing opera last time, and I introduced that first because remember, 1600, the year of the earliest surviving opera. All right, that kind of like defines the beginning of the Baroque. Opera is really the first genre we should talk about because it's so influential on all the others. But after dealing with opera, I want to talk about all the different types of instrumental music because there are so many different types, so many different genres, and I'll cover all those. And then again, toward the end, as we get to the late Baroque composers, J.S. Bach and George Frederick Handel, both born the same year, 1685, then we'll get back to vocal music and to talking about the oratorio and the cantata. So, last lecture, toward the very end, I talked about this recitative from his opera Orfeo by Claudio Monteverdi. And the title of this piece is You Are Dead. And it is the moment in this opera when Orpheus, or Orfeo in the Italianized version of his name, has learned that Eurydice has died. She was bitten by a snake, and now she's gone down into the underworld. And Orpheus sings about how he just can't handle it. He can't process this information, and then he resolves to do something about it, to go into the underworld and to try and bring her back out. So the purpose of this recitative, as so many recitatives do, is to tell us what's about to happen, to fill us in, us being the audience, on what happens next in the story. Right? Now there's also a little bit at the beginning of this sort of expressing emotions. He is expressing his feelings on learning of the death of Eurydice, but most of this recitative is describing what he's about to do, right? So this is the purpose of recitative very often, because we don't have time in an opera, or it's a little difficult if we are going to be having music all the way through. Remember, opera is sung from beginning to end, right? There's constant music going on, and it might be difficult to actually have action take place. It might be better to tell rather than show, right? So this is where we are told what's about to happen. Hopefully you've had a chance to listen to this recitative. If not, maybe you want to pause the video here, go and listen to it. It's very short. It's only, 3 minutes long. And then come back, and I'm going to just play a little bit of it on my keyboard here, and I'm just going to mostly just focus in on the first couple of lines so that I can point out some of the unusual practices for this time, for 1607, that Monteverdi engages in order to express the meaning of the text. So at the very beginning, we hear, I guess it's an organ, we hear the instruments accompanying the singers. I've got my keyboard set to a harpsichord sound here. It doesn't really matter. We hear a G minor chord, right? And this chord would have been indicated to the keyboard player in the pit orchestra. It would have been indicated by just a G, just the note G in the bass. And then if there were some numbers, or in this case there wouldn't be any numbers, without any numbers you just sort of fill in the rest of the chord. Remember, this is what figured bass is. It's what the keyboard player would be reading, which is symbols to indicate what chords you should play. Since the actual notes aren't written in, except for the bass note itself, the keyboard player would have a little bit of leeway to play the chord in whichever way they want, really, as long as it's the right notes. So someone might do it, this way, or they might just play the chord. That's kind of boring. They probably wouldn't do that. They might do something like this, fill in a little tone in there. So we have the chord, and then the singer sings over top of it. And in this case, the notes are Tu sei morta. And that second note in particular is an F sharp. Tu on the word say. Tu sei morta. That F sharp clashes with the rest of the chord, right? And it creates a dissonance. It's what we call an unprepared dissonance. This is what I was talking about in the last lecture, that this is one of Monteverdi's innovations, that he uses unprepared dissonances with new daring and freedom, or whatever terms the book uses. So that might not sound all that remarkable to us today, 400 years later. A lot has happened in music history since then, and this kind of thing, Tu sei morta, maybe doesn't sound all that radical, but it was radical at the time, because in the Renaissance, remember, there was dissonance, but dissonances had to be blended in. So if a composer in the Renaissance was going to have an F sharp, it would have to be either approached, that F sharp would have to be approached by common tone, that is, preceded by another F sharp, and resolved by step, or maybe approached by step, that is, approached from a note right next door, either above or below. So you could maybe do something like this. In that case, because I'm approaching the F sharp by step, it doesn't stick out as much. But if I am jumping to the F sharp, which I am doing from above here, right? I'm going from B flat, F sharp, G. It makes that F sharp stick out more. It's more conspicuous. It isn't blended in. Monteverdi's putting it out there for us all to hear, right? That would have been considered wrong, a mistake. You would get marked off for that if you were a composition student in the Renaissance. But the reason, obviously, that Monteverdi is doing this is that he wants us to feel this anguish that Orpheus feels as he sings the words, "You are dead, tu sei morta." Let's go on just a little bit from there. I'm not going to do this whole thing, but Tu sei morta. And then we have a change from this G minor chord to a D minor chord. Then we have an A minor chord, and the singer comes in again. Se morta mia vita. So once again, we have the A minor chord and Se morta. This G sharp clashes against the harmony, against the A. Again, we feel that same little tinge of pain on the same word. Tu sei morta. Se morta mia vita. Okay, so mia vita. Tu sei morta Tu sei morta, mia vita. The way the book translate this, it's wrong. It says, you are dead, my dearest. Well, mia vita does not mean my dearest. It is sort of a pet name that one might give to one's beloved, but it's my life, mia vita, right? And so this is why this poetry set to music is so wonderful. There's a contrast here. He's saying, you are dead, my life. His pet name for her is my life. You might call your honey bun my love. His name for her apparently is my life. And this points up the contradiction between death and life. How can she be dead? She's my whole life, right? And in this whole first section of this recitative, he's trying to sort of reconcile this irreconcilable conflict between this woman who was his whole life is now dead. You have left me forevermore, yet I remain. Right. Another interesting thing about just that first line. Again, so we have 4 chords harmonizing the first line of text. First a G minor chord, tu sei morta, and then a D minor chord, and then an A minor chord. All minor chords so far. Se morta mia vita. Now we have a major chord. It's an E major chord. So we have 3 minor chords in a row, and then only on the word vita, life, do we have a major chord, right? So the minor chords are kind of like representing death. They sound gloomy. But then the E major chord it's major. It sounds more hopeful. And of course, it coincides with the word vita, which not only means life, but it symbolizes her, right? So it's sort of like a fond thought of her. She, of course, Eurydice, is going to be represented by a major chord, whereas death is going to be represented by minor chords. Later on, when he repeats, when he says, he sings basically the same melody. Yeah, there it is, where he sings, you have left me. Tu sei mi partita. Again, the G minor chord. This time the melody starts on a higher note. Tu sei mi partita. And once again, he this time repeats several times, and not just on the word se, but se da mi partita, emphasizing that F sharp, which clashes against the G minor harmony, and he's approaching it with an even larger lead, making it stick out that much more. Tu sei da mi partita, right? So it's sort of like his pain is intensifying as he sings this song. One other thing that I want to point out that isn't necessarily obvious from reading the translation, notice how after 4 lines he says the words, you have left me forevermore, never to return, and I remain. Again, something that it's a contradiction that he can't wrap his mind around. You have left me forevermore, never to return, yet I remain. The word for remain in Italian is rimango, and you can see at the end of that word, it's ngo, but it's pronounced sort of like gno, and there's a dash. Adio rimango, no. The last syllable of rimango turns into no, and this is the moment when Orpheus resolves, like, no, I refuse to accept this thing that I can't wrap my mind around, the fact that you are my life, yet you are dead. You have left me, yet I must remain. No, I'm going to go. And this is when he outlines his plan of action. I'm going to go into the deepest abysses. I'm going to go into the underworld. I'm going to find the Lord of the dead, Lord Hades. I'm going to sing my songs for him, and he will be so moved, he will let me leave with you. And that's the action plan that is outlined in this recitative. All right. This kind of thing, this kind of use of dissonance, again, was considered kind of shocking and incorrect. Monteverdi often had people sort of write criticisms of his music. They would write reviews, or they would write a treatise or whatever on Monteverdi's music and say, but this guy doesn't know what he's doing. It's like he doesn't realize that you can't do that with these intervals, and you can't have those dissonances kind of sticking out there like that. That's not the correct way to do it. And Monteverdi's response was, no, what you're talking about is an older practice, a completely different practice. I am engaged in a different, new practice, and my goal is to express the meaning of the words. The music exists to help express the meaning of the words and to help the listener feel the emotions you're supposed to feel. Right? So that means your old rules in your old polyphonic texture, right? It just doesn't apply anymore in this new style. Okay, moving on now to the composer Henry Purcell. And I'm trying to move chronologically. So we go from an early Baroque composer, the most important early Baroque composer, Claudio Monteverdi, to a very important mid-Baroque composer, Henry Purcell, basically considered to be maybe the greatest English composer of all time. Certainly the greatest English composer prior to the 20th century, and also the composer of the greatest opera in the English language, Dido and Aeneas. So we'll talk about Dido and Aeneas a little bit, and we'll talk about the excerpt, which the book includes in your listening, and that is a recitative followed by an aria, and this aria is known as Dido's Lament. So first, about Purcell. As you can see from his dates, 1659 to 1695, awfully short life. He only lived to be 36 years old. Supposedly, the way he died, at least this is what I've read, apparently Purcell liked to go out with his friends, his buddies, and hang out late at night and drink. And he would come home very often, very late, and his wife was annoyed by this. And she warned him one day. She said, Henry, if you stay out one more time till 3 o'clock in the morning with your friends, I'm going to lock the door when you come back, and that'll fix you. And apparently she made good on her threat, and Purcell came home. I don't know why he didn't have his key on him, but he was locked out of his house, and apparently it was a cold night, and he froze to death. That's the story anyway. But until that happened, he had a pretty sensational career. He at one time or another had really all of the most important musical jobs in England. So started off as a choir boy in the Chapel Royal, that is the royal chapel of the royal family. He was appointed composer to the King's Stringed Orchestra at age 18. Pretty amazing at 18 to have one of the top court composer jobs, really in all of Europe, certainly in England. 2 years later, appointed organist at Westminster Abbey. You may have seen Westminster Abbey if you watched the coronation of King Charles recently, or any of the coronations and royal weddings take place in Westminster Abbey. So he was organist there, later became organist at the Chapel Royal, the same place where he had started out as a choir boy. And all this time, he's composing both sacred and secular music, vocal and instrumental music, basically every genre of music of the time. The piece that the book has chosen is to represent Purcell is maybe his greatest or his best known work, and the greatest opera in the English language. It's kind of recognized as, certainly of the Baroque era, the greatest opera in the English language. Not a whole lot of opera in English. I think I mentioned last time, probably 80-85% of all opera is in Italian. I would say after Italian, French opera there's quite a lot of that. German opera. And then, there's a little bit of Russian, there's some Spanish, whatever. English, there's just not too many operas in the English language. But This one was composed 1689 specifically for a performance, the first performance at an English girls' school. So at the debut performance, all the performers were like teenage girls. And because it wasn't intended to be performed by professional musicians, it's shorter. It's only about an hour long. Musically, it's not terribly challenging, but it's a great work, and it is based upon a based on Roman mythology. Now remember, this is again a thing to remember about early opera. Remember, the reason that opera was invented in the first place by the Camerata, I talked about this last time. The idea was to reinvent Greek drama, ancient Greek drama, but in a modern language like Italian, or in this case English, but in the same style that those dramas were done. That is, sung from beginning to end, sometimes with this speech-like singing, which we call recitative. But the subject matter, therefore, of early operas tends to be Greek myth, like the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, or in this case, Greek/Roman myth. So who is Dido and who is Aeneas? Dido is this mythical queen of Carthage, and Aeneas is essentially sort of like the ancestor of the founders of Rome, Remus and Romulus. And all of this, this is what I'm about to, this story, none of it is true, but it was sort of like what the Romans understood to be the sort of founding story of their empire, of their republic and later empire. The story of Dido and Aeneas is really just one episode out of an epic poem called the Aeneid, which was written by Virgil. Virgil was basically the court poet of the Emperor Augustus, the very first emperor of Rome. Just in case you're a little bit rusty on your ancient history, you all know about the assassination of Julius Caesar, right? 44 BC. When Julius Caesar was killed, there was a period of civil war. And at the end of that period of civil war, the person who emerged victorious was the heir, the nephew of Julius Caesar, Augustus. His name was Octavian, but then when he became emperor, his name became Augustus, Caesar Augustus, and he is the first emperor of Rome. And as many emperors did, and other kinds of rulers in those days, one of the things that you wanted to do was have sort of like your own propaganda machine. You wanted people writing poems and books about your reign and about how wonderful an emperor you were. And this was part of Virgil's job, is to reflect the glory of Augustus's reign. And also, I think what the Romans wanted to do is kind of like, they had a little bit, I think, of cultural jealousy of the Greeks. Now, by this time, Greece had become part of the Roman Empire. And I'm sure you're probably aware of some of the connections between Greek myth and Roman myth. But the Roman origin story, as told in the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas, that's what that means. The Aeneid is this long epic poem about Aeneas, just like the Odyssey is a long epic poem about Odysseus. Right? So Aeneas is a survivor of the destruction of Troy. You know, the Trojan Wars, which is the subject of the Iliad, right? Helen of Troy, all that. If you've seen the movie with Brad Pitt, that's a pretty good starting point. So the Greeks destroy the city of Troy and burn it to the ground, and almost all of the residents of Troy are killed. But Aeneas, who is a prince, a Trojan prince, escapes the destruction, and he and a few hundred survivors board a fleet of ships, and they sail out into the Mediterranean looking for a place to settle and to build a new Troy, which ultimately ends up being Rome. right? And this is how Rome, remember, with this kind of little bit of cultural envy of the Greeks, they're trying to sort of tie themselves into this wonderful body of Greek myth and Greek culture which had existed for so long. So the Romans kind of imagine themselves to be descended from the survivors of the defeated city of Troy, right? Not really true, but that was the story they told themselves. Anyway, one episode in the Aeneid concerns Aeneas and his fleet of ships encountering a storm, being blown off course, and winding up at the North African port city of Carthage. Now, you may know from your Roman history that Rome and Carthage fought what was then sort of like the world wars of their time, the Punic Wars. There were 3 of them, and ultimately Carthage lost to Rome and was destroyed, was burned to the ground. I mean, ultimately, later it was rebuilt and resettled by the Romans as North Africa became part of the Roman Empire. But this episode, this completely fictional episode, I think serves the purpose of like, in case anyone in Rome wondered, well, what was the origin of this bad feelings between Rome and Carthage anyway? I mean, in real history, it was they were rivals for control of the Mediterranean, right? Carthage was a very powerful and wealthy port city, trading all along the Mediterranean. And as Rome grew in power and in influence, the 2 of them were bound to butt heads. And that's what the Punic Wars were all about, these wars between Rome and Carthage. Well, according to the Aeneid, the reason for the real origin for the bad feelings between Rome and Carthage is that when Aeneas was blown off course and his ships took refuge in Carthage, the queen of Carthage, Dido, took them in, welcomed them, and in particular welcomed Aeneas and fell in love with Aeneas. As Aeneas was telling the story of the destruction of Troy and their hardships and their voyages, Dido fell in love with Aeneas. So they're in love, but here's the thing. Aeneas has been given a mission by the gods to find a new city, to settle the people, the refugees from Carthage, and to found a new city, which is destined to be this city of Rome. Aeneas cannot deny the gods, right? Not a good thing to do. So as much as he would like to stick around and settle down in Carthage with his new girlfriend, Queen Dido, he tells her, look, I've got a mission. I'm on a mission from the gods. I have to leave. And they have a big fight. And she says, oh, you and your mission from the gods. If you want to leave, then go ahead and leave. I don't mind. And then Aeneas says, well, okay, look, here's how much I love you. I'm going to defy the gods for you. I'll stay here with you. And she says, no, you really want to go, don't you? Why don't you leave? So they get in a fight, and ultimately Aeneas storms off. He rounds everybody up. He says, come on, get on the ships. We're going to go. And Dido sees them sailing away, and she notices that Aeneas has left his sword behind in her room. So she sings this lament, which we're about to hear, and stabs herself with the sword and dies. And that's why there were such bad feelings. And she also curses Aeneas before she kills herself. And this is the origin of the bad feelings between Troy and Carthage. I'm sorry, between Carthage and Rome. Okay, so that kind of sets up the scene. This is basically the final scene from Dido and Aeneas, the final recitative and aria. I believe there's one more chorus after this, but and the book talks about ground bass. Remember, I talked about actually I think it was in lecture 1 or 2 in the Baroque about ground bass. This is a repeating pattern in the bass. It's also sometimes called basso ostinato, stubborn bass, obstinate bass. And we're going to hear in this piece this repeated bass line, this descending stepwise pattern over and over again, which kind of symbolizes Dido's impending death. Okay, so this excerpt, which you can listen to on your own, we're not going to listen to it here. Whenever I play recordings on these videos, I get tagged with copyright notices, and they take forever to upload, and they sometimes get restricted. So I'm not going to play it myself, but I will play. I'll talk a little bit about it, and I'll maybe play a little bit of the music that you see in your listening guide on my own little keyboard here. So it starts with a recitative, and it's basically Dido in her chambers with her friend Belinda, her lady in waiting. Of course, Dido is a queen, so she has ladies in waiting, and Belinda is her closest friend, her lady in waiting, and she says, "Give me your hand, thy hand, Belinda. Darkness shades me. On thy bosom let me rest. More I would, but death invades me. Death is now a welcome guest." Notice, when you get to this, the word death, when you hear it in this recitative, each time, sort of like in the other excerpt we listened to, "Tu sei morta," on the word death, there's always a dissonance, an unprepared dissonance, so that the note sounds a little bit jarring. It sounds a little bit painful, right? Okay, and then the aria itself starts after the recitative, and this aria has this descending bass, and we hear this bass repeated over and over again, and it's just this descending by half steps until it gets here. And by the way, same key, G minor, as Tu sei morta, right? And she sings over it. I can't sing that high, but so we have a chord progression. Notice that dissonance right there, right on the downbeat. When I am laid, in her, create, and then it starts over again. And this pattern, this bass pattern, just repeats relentlessly. It's unstoppable. It's her fate to die, right? It's unavoidable. And this downward motion not only represents her death, but almost like her sinking into the grave, we can think of. And she's singing, "When I am laid in the earth." She's saying, "When I'm laid in the earth." She's singing to Aeneas. Now, Aeneas is already on the ship. He's pulling away. But nonetheless, she's singing to him as if he can hear her. "When I am laid in the earth, when I am dead, don't worry about me. Don't think of me badly, right? May my wrongs create no trouble in your breast." And then she sings, "Remember me." Whenever she sings the words, "Remember me. Remember me," it's like a monotone. This is sort of an intentional thing. This is part of this doctrine of affections, which I talked about. This system that Baroque composers came up with to symbolize certain emotional states, or to symbolize content within the music. So the descending bass line represents death. And when she sings "Remember Me" on this monotone, it's like the way that a ghost might speak. "Remember me, I am a ghost, I am dead. I have no emotions, therefore I speak in a monotone." If you've ever seen like A Christmas Carol, the old movie version with Alistair Sim and whatever, when the ghost of Scrooge shows up, he talks in a monotone, and Scrooge asks him, "Who are you?" He says, Ask me not who I am, ask me who I was. You know, he's speaking in this monotone because he's not real, he's just a ghost, right? So I'm pretty sure this is intentional on Purcell's part to take those words, remember me, and sing them all just on one repeated note, right? In this kind of dead manner. Remember me, but forget my fate. Anyway, so that is Dido's Lament. Listen to that, but in the remaining part of this lecture, I'm going to start to talk about some genres of instrumental music, and I'm going to continue probably for at least the next 2 lectures talking about various types of instrumental music and some composers along the way. And then toward the end, we'll get back to vocal music and we'll talk about our 2 late Baroque masters, George Frederick Handel and J.S. Bach. So we could look at these various instrumental genres in any particular order. It doesn't really matter, but I think I'm going to start with the sonata. The book talks about the Baroque sonata beginning on page 131. The word sonata simply means a piece that is to be played on an instrument. It's a very, very broad term, right? The use of the word sonata, it has something to do with sound, as you can see. And this is because back in the old days, even in the English language, instead of saying, I am playing the violin or I'm playing the flute, you might say, I am sounding on the violin or I am sounding on the flute. So sounding was like a verb. And if you were playing or sounding a piece that is for an instrument, you might use the title sonata. It just means instrumental piece, okay? Now, there are sonatas for solo instruments, which are called solo sonatas. And then there are sonatas for groups of instruments. The solo sonatas, actually there's 2 different types, because some solo sonatas aren't really solo. For example, a solo flute sonata is for a flute soloist, but also a keyboard player, right, accompanying the flute. If we want a sonata for, let's say, an instrument like a violin or a melodic instrument like a violin or a flute, and we don't want any of that accompaniment, keyboard accompaniment, we would call it an unaccompanied sonata, right? So we have solo sonatas which may or may not have keyboard accompaniment. Of course, if it's a sonata for keyboard, it's for keyboard, so we don't need keyboard accompaniment. But the instruments like flute, like violin, that have a difficult time playing chords or are impossible to play chords on, like a flute, you might want to have some keyboard in the background to provide some harmonic support. So you would have an accompanied solo sonata versus an unaccompanied solo sonata. The type of sonata the book talks about is and provides an example of is a trio sonata. I don't believe there's a listening guide. I mean, they show a little bit of the music here, which I'll talk about. I don't think there's a listening embedded in your book, so I'll post a link to it in the announcement and maybe in the comments of this lecture. But a sonata, it's again very, very broad term, and composers composed works with the title sonata beginning in the very early Baroque right up to the present day. The title sonata is probably the single most commonly used title for any piece of instrumental music. And all it means is piece of instrumental music. In the Baroque era, it was understood that a sonata would be a multi-movement piece, usually 3 or 4 movements, right? And these different movements, like any multi-movement piece, they would have their own beginning and ending, and they would usually contrast in mood and in tempo. Usually the first movement was fast in tempo, and also the last movement was fast, which meant the middle movement would be slow, or if there's 2 middle movements, maybe one of them would be fast, one of them would be slow. Maybe one of them would be more song-like in nature, and the other one more dance-like, right? Also, composers at the time sometimes made a distinction between the sonata da chiesa and the Sonata da Camera. What they called the church sonata, chiesa means church, and the chamber sonata, the Sonata da Camera. Well, why would we be playing a sonata in church? Well, the Catholic Church, yes, they didn't so much appreciate instrumental music in church. That was certainly true in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. This rule is beginning to become relaxed somewhat because we are now in the age of instrumental music, and it was bound to creep into the church. And I think I mentioned also last lecture, in places like Venice, for example, they actually really liked to hear instruments in church. That was sort of like their own homegrown tradition. And if the authorities in Rome didn't like it, too bad. We like to have instrumental music performed in church. These sonata da chiesa were not necessarily performed in church, though. What it really, the difference seems to have been the chamber sonata, which would be played in a room, in a chamber, usually had more dance-like movements. That is, the titles of the individual movements might be actually related to an existing dance form. So the chamber sonata is more dance-like. The church sonata is maybe a little more dignified in character and doesn't have this dance-like element. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this trio sonata. A trio sonata is a type of chamber music. It's instrumental music for a small group, right? And you might think from the term trio, oh, it must be three performers. No, it is not. There are three parts written into the music, but one of those parts, the basso continuo, requires two people to perform it. So a trio sonata actually requires four performers. And you can see this actually on the next page. I'm going to hold it up to the music, but you should have this image right in your textbook. I'm sorry, I'm going to hold it up to the camera. Do you see how this is just the first couple of measures of the trio sonata by Corelli? And as is usually the case in a trio sonata, we have two melodic instruments. And in this case, it's two violins. First violin, second violin. Sometimes we have, let's say, violin and flute. That's another common configuration. We have two melodic instruments, and then we have the basso continuo. The basso continuo, well, there's just, bass notes written there, and some figures, some symbols underneath, some numbers and some like sharps and stuff like that. This is figured bass. This is that abbreviated system of notation that I was talking about. So the musicians looking at this, well, you would probably have a keyboard player and maybe a cellist. The cellist would just be playing the notes, the bass line. The keyboard player would be looking at the bass line and, in combination with the cymbals, figuring out what chord to play. Right? So both the cellist and the keyboard player, whoever's playing the bass line, could be a bassoon, a low-pitched melodic instrument. They're both reading off of this one part, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 players required for a trio sonata. Now, having said that, it's possible to play a trio sonata all by yourself on an instrument like the organ. And there are some trio sonatas. They're still written out in 3 parts, like right hand, left hand, pedals, right? There are some trio sonatas that are written for the solo organ, if it wasn't confusing enough already. But just remember, trio sonata has 3 parts, and if it's played by a chamber group, such as in the example described in the book, you need 4 people. All right, let's talk a little bit about the composer of this particular sonata, Arcangelo Corelli. So Corelli, like Purcell, whom we just talked about, is a mid-Baroque composer. His dates are 1653 to 1713. So born just 6 years before Henry Purcell, but managed to live a little bit longer, all the way to 1713. I would say Corelli is maybe the most important composer of the mid-Baroque for several reasons, mostly because he represents sort of a trend that continues forward. He was, first of all, the greatest string player of his day, right? His day being the mid-Baroque era. So the greatest string performer of his day, the greatest violinist of his day. He sort of established sort of modern violin technique, right? He was a great teacher of the violin, but he was also the earliest major composer to have made a successful career for himself based solely on instrumental composition. Corelli never composed any vocal music at all, right? So that would have been kind of unheard of, again, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, or even in the early Baroque. But now we are midway through the Baroque, right? And one of these major characteristics of the Baroque is the rise of instrumental music, how composers are spending more and more, there's more and more demand for instrumental music, and composers are filling that demand, and they are writing more and more instrumental works, so that by the time we get to the late Baroque again, there's really more instrumental music being written than vocal music. And that vocal music even requires instruments as well, like opera or oratorio or cantata. All of them involve instruments as well as voices. So here we are halfway through the Baroque, and we've gotten to a point where instrumental music, there's such demand for it that you could make a living as a composer, as a performer, just specializing in instrumental music, right? So the type of pieces that Corelli composed, they mention here, 60 sonatas and 12 concertos, all for strings, right? And they talk about the example of the trio sonata. I'll certainly read this, and I will post a link to it. But since they introduced the concerto, let's make that our next genre of instrumental music. And since I don't have all that much time left, I'm just going to talk about what a concerto is, the different varieties of concertos, and that can lead us into some more detail next time, and also we'll talk about our next composer, Antonio Vivaldi. The genre of the concerto is mentioned in a couple of different places in the textbook, so we kind of have to jump around a bit if we want to cover it. The first place that it is mentioned is back on page 109, where it talks about the concerto grosso and ritornello form. So we'll talk about ritornello form in a second. That is important, but we'll come back to that. The concerto grosso is one type of concerto. There's two main important types. The concerto grosso, and grosso just means big, the big concerto, and the solo concerto. The book defines the solo concerto over here on page 133 in the same few paragraphs where they talk about Vivaldi, right? Vivaldi wrote like 450 concertos of various types. All right, so we have a term, concerto. It's a type of piece for orchestra in the Baroque. There are two varieties of concerto. There's the concerto grosso and the solo concerto. What's the difference? Well, here's what they have in common. All concertos are for orchestra, right? They pretty much all have three movements. These are three movement pieces. The first movement is fast in tempo. Second movement is slow. Third movement is fast again. That's sort of the formula, right? The difference between the two is, in a solo concerto, we have an individual soloist who is featured, right? So a solo concerto is really a piece for a solo performer and orchestra in conjunction, right? And there are going to be times when just the soloist plays, and then there's going to be times when everybody plays. So we could refer to these as solo sections, and then those places where everybody plays, we call them tutti. In fact, it's written into the score, T-U-T-T-I, tutti. Tutti in Italian simply means all. So if all the players are playing, everybody in the orchestra is playing, that's a tutti section, right? So we have sections that alternate between the individual soloist and tutti, all. Solo sections, tutti sections, okay? And the idea of a solo concerto is to kind of to showcase a particular performer. And so very often there'll be sort of like flashy, difficult stuff, which is meant to impress the audience, right? Usually the soloist is going to be a violinist. That's probably the most common type of concerto at the time, although there were keyboard concertos, usually harpsichord. This is the time, remember, before the piano. Later on, we get into the classical era and the Romantic era, the piano concerto becomes very, very popular. But in the Baroque era, mostly violin concertos, some keyboard concertos, some flute concertos, cello concertos, oboe concertos. There are a few, any instrument could be the soloist, theoretically, but in practice, probably the violin concerto, it would be number one, and the keyboard concerto would probably be number two. Remember, the various bowed-stringed instruments, the violin family, and the keyboard, these are the most important instruments of the Baroque. Okay, how about a concerto grosso? Well, in a concerto grosso, instead of an individual soloist, what you have is a small group, usually of three. And those three will usually be two melodic instruments and the keyboard player, right? And this small group is called the concertino, which literally means small group. Concert means group in Italian, and when we put ino on the end of it, it means small, the little group. So instead of an individual soloist, we have a small group of soloists, but they have that same function. There are places when just the small group plays, solo sections, although it's not strictly solo because there's three people. Solo sections and tutti sections where everybody plays. Right? That's the only difference between a concerto grosso and a solo concerto. The example of the concerto grosso in your book is by J.S. Bach. It's one of his 6 so-called Brandenburg concertos, so-called because he took 6 concertos that he had already written and sent them to the Elector of Brandenburg, who was a high and mighty member of the nobility. He sent them as sort of as a gift, probably hoping that he would be invited to the court of the Elector of Brandenburg, perhaps to get a job there eventually. But these 6 Brandenburg concertos are probably the best known work by orchestral work by J.S. Bach. They're wonderful, wonderful pieces, and certainly you should listen to them. As an example of a solo concerto, we have a piece that I know that you've heard at least some of before. You've heard the first movement before. This is the spring concerto, La Primavera. I love the Italian word for spring. Primavera means first green. Prima means first, vera means green. So this is one of something like 450 concertos that Vivaldi composed. He composed a set of 4 in particular called the Seasons. And there's one concerto for each season. So there's a spring, there's a summer, there's a fall, and there's a winter. Each one of these concertos has 3 movements. Right? So this is an example, by the way, of what we call program music. Instrumental music that has a sort of a storyline behind it, right? Where we are supposed to be imagining something specific that the composer has clued us in on, very often just by way of the title itself, right? So even if nothing else, if we have the title of a piece of music is Spring, then even before we hear anything, this piece is about spring, I'm going to be listening for spring-like things, maybe chirping birds or whatever, right? Even if there's no singing going on. So remember, there are no words, at least the performers aren't, this is strictly instrumental music. But as we will see when we talk about this piece in more detail next time, there are words written into the score that Vivaldi wanted the performers to see so that they would know what kinds of sounds that they were supposed to be imitating. It's kind of ingenious. The audience doesn't know about those words, but the performers do. So we will talk about these two examples. We'll see how this idea of the concerto plays out. Oh, finally, I should mention about ritornello form before I go. Back in the section where they talk about the concerto grosso and ritornello form, again, back to page 109. We're going to have to kind of flip back and forth between these two sections in order to cover the concerto. Ritornello form refers to the structure of the first movement and the last movement of a concerto. Right. The middle movement, the slow movement, is not usually in ritornello form, but the first movement and the last movement will be. The word ritornello means the little thing that returns. Ritorn, they spell it a little differently in Italian. It's R-I-T-O-R-N, but it's the same word, return. The ritornello is a melody, is a theme that we hear right at the beginning of the first movement and then later the last movement. It's not the same melody. It's going to be a different melody, but you will hear in both this Bach example and in the Vivaldi example, at the very beginning we hear a tune. We hear a melody. It's kind of catchy. We hear that melody played usually by the entire orchestra, by the tutti, by all, right? And then once we've heard that melody, we hear something different, something contrasting. And that something contrasting will very often be played by the soloists, right? Either the individual soloist, if we're talking about a solo concerto, or the concertino, the small group of soloists, if we're talking about a concerto grosso. So the soloists will play, and they'll play some like technically challenging, impressive, flashy kind of stuff, usually. And then after that's over with, we will hear the ritornello. That melody will return. It'll be played probably by the entire orchestra. That'll be the next tutti section. And after we've heard that melody again, we hear something different yet again, played by the soloists most likely. All right? So it's like ritornello melody X, played by the soloist. Ritornello melody Y, something different from anything we've heard before, played by the soloists most likely. And then the ritornello melody will come back yet again, and maybe we'll have one final solo section. We could call it Z. At the very end, the ritornello melody will come back one last time, right? Now, depending on how long the movement is, you know, it could be like ritornello A, ritornello B, ritornello C. I mean, we could have many, many different contrasting episodes in between the appearances of the ritornello melody. But however many there are, we're going to begin with the ritornello and we're going to end with the ritornello. And that's the form, right? And this is the form that we will see in the first movement and also the last movement. Now, the material which goes into the form, the tunes themselves, the musical material will be different in the first movement as in the last movement. The contents will be different, but the form, the arrangement of the contents will be the same, or you know, very, very similar in the first and the last movement. In the Bach example, this is a concerto grosso, the Brandenburg concerto. It's quite a bit longer, so there are more returns of the ritornello and there are more solo episodes. But sometimes Bach doesn't bring back the entire ritornello melody. He maybe just brings back enough of it for you to hear, oh yeah, there's that familiar beginning section. He doesn't necessarily need to play the entire ritornello. Same thing in the Vivaldi. Now, in the Vivaldi, that's a shorter piece, so there aren't as many instances of the ritornello. There aren't as many contrasting episodes in between those appearances of the ritornello, but the basic idea behind the form is the same. The ritornello provides the continuity. It provides something familiar for us to grab onto when we hear it. And the contrasting episodes provide us with variety. So, listen to the Vivaldi, listen to the Bach, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out next time. And we'll talk about some other genres of instrumental music. See you then.